Let's continue. In this video lesson, we'll finish the rest of the components of the balance of payments. So the next part of the balance of payments will be the capital account, which will include all transactions related to the transfer of funds due to sale of assets and liabilities. So if we continue with our example on balance of payments for the UK, you will see that in a particular year we had a capital account balance which was negative and which represented a small part of GDP, minus 0.1%. The third big part of the balance of payments will include the financial account or official reserves account. This will include changes in our holdings of gold, foreign currencies, special drawing rights, reserve positions in International Monetary Fund, and so on. And here, in the financial account, we will record transactions related to investment, direct and portfolio investments into our economy, other financial flows, which are mainly short-term, and other flows to and from reserves. So if we continue with our example, it will look like this. We'll have net direct investment, portfolio investment balance, other investment, and so on, reserve assets. And as a result, you will see that we will have a surplus here on this particular part of the balance of payments. Remember, we used to run a deficit in our trade with the rest of the world. In this particular year, the capital account was also negative, so that is why we need to ensure that we have a positive balance on the financial account. We will need to finance this by attracting direct investment from abroad. And then the complete balance of payments for the UK for this particular year will have four components: current account, capital account, financial or reserves account, and the last part, the last sections, which will include net errors and omissions. Current balance, as we've learned already in the UK, tends to be negative. We are running a trade deficit, and quite significant one, more than 4% of GDP. Capital account is around zero, so in this case it's slightly negative, but it can vary from one year to another. And because we are running a combined deficit on current and capital account, we'll need to ensure that we cover it with our financial account. And if these numbers do not add up to zero, this will be recorded within the net errors and omissions section. So that is why the whole balance will need to be equal to zero. If we add average data for the last 3 decades, we will see that the extent of our deficit in our trade with the rest of the world is actually deteriorating. Previously, in the previous decades, we used to have on average minus 2% of GDP deficit. Now we nearly doubled it. We actually export much less than we import by considerably higher amount, by higher percentage of GDP. On average, we used to balance our capital account, but we used to run a deficit for an extended period of time in our trade with the rest of the world. And we used to have an equivalent or similar surplus on the financial account. In this year, in this particular period, in recent periods, we'll have to increase this balance in order to ensure that we can pay for our imports. One type of exam question which can be asked based on this information, based on the formula for the whole balance of payments, will look like this. So as always, please stop the video, write down your answer, and come back when you are ready. Ready? Let's have a look at the solution. The whole question is based on the formula for the balance of payments identity, which basically tells us that the sum of all components in the balance of payments must add up to zero. So a sum of current account, capital account, reserves account, and net errors and omissions should be equal to zero. I'm not including net errors and omissions here into this formula because, strictly speaking, they're supposed to be equal to zero. They're supposed to be not existent. But in reality, we do have some net errors and omissions section. So generally, in this particular question, we have a current account deficit of 1 billion. In other words, we have minus 1 billion here in this particular component of our balance of payments. This implies that we need to have plus 1 in the rest of the formula. In other words, we'll need to have plus 1 billion, or 1 billion in surplus in the sum of our capital account, reserves account, and errors section as well. So basically, this is the answer. We'll need to have a surplus in the sum of all other accounts. Let's have a look what option will provide this solution. There must be surplus on trade and services. No, because trade and services are included in the current account, so we can eliminate A. There must be an equivalent deficit on the capital plus financial account. No, because we have a deficit here already. We need to have a surplus here. So eliminate B. There must be a net errors and omissions item of 1 billion. There could be, but doesn't have to be, because we can cover this deficit with the surplus in one or of these accounts, not necessarily errors and omissions. So it must not be. It could be, but not necessarily must be. Similar answer would be here. Financial account must be +1. Not necessarily financial account, so reserves account. It could come from some other areas. It could actually come from all of these areas. As long as the sum of these three components is equal to +1 billion, if we run a combined surplus in all these three accounts, this would be fine. This will ensure that our balance of payments will add up to 0. So the overall capital plus financial account or reserves account, including net errors and omissions, must be equal to +1. This is the exam type of question which you might get based on this material. So let's have a look at some more graphs. So this graph repeats the trend which we have covered already. It shows us that British balance of payments generally has issues on the current account side. We do tend to run current account deficits, and basically it's our constant problem. If we look at these figures as a percentage of GDP, we can also see that it tends to increase. So generally, we used to run balanced trade roughly around 1995. This was the single year where we've managed to more or less balance it. But after this period, and previously we've had these issues before, this was the single year where we've managed to balance our trade more or less. It was close to 0. But since then, our current account deficit, shown here in red, is increasing as a percentage of GDP. So instead of 1%, now we are running more than 4% GDP. And this requires us to have a surplus, an equivalent surplus on some other accounts. And we tend to do this in these blue sections, which is financial account net flows. We finance our consumption, our purchases of import, by attracting foreign investment from abroad. And net errors and omissions can come on any site, depending on the year, depending on quality of data we have in a specific year.